Harrison is in the waiting room. We're ready to proceed.
Yes, Your
Okay.
Honor. Yes, Your Honor, for the legislative defendants.
Yes, we're ready to go, Your Honor, for the state defendants.
All right, Madam Clerk, can you please let Pricey Harrison back into the courtroom?
She's been admitted, sir.
Thank you. Miss Harrison, can you hear me? Miss Fawcett, do you have everything good? Do you give me a thumbs up? Okay, great. Looks like everyone's here then, and we are ready to proceed. We can now go back on the record officially. Miss Harrison, can you hear me? Is anyone else getting a response from Miss Harrison?
Representative Harrison?
Right now, I do not see her name on the list of participants, but
Judge
I did
Poovey,
see
I
it.
see her there. She just can't hear us.
oh, okay. Oh, we can hear. I do see her now too. Miss Harrison, can you hear me? She obviously cannot.
She appears to be trying to troubleshoot.
I am not hearing anything. Should I be hearing something?
Yes,
Representative,
can you hear me now? We can now hear her. Representative Harrison, can you hear me? Check 1 2, check 1 2.
Your Honor, this is Miss Klein for the plaintiffs. I've just reached out to Rep. Harrison for the purposes of figuring out this tech issue. She cannot hear us.
Okay,
Actually, I'm sorry. I can hear you now. Maybe it was my earphones, but can y'all hear me okay?
we can. Thank you very much.
Great.
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
I apologize. I don't know what
That's
happened.
okay. That's okay. You're not the first one who's had technical issues in this trial, and I suspect you won't be the last either. So it's all good. I'm glad you can hear us now. Are you ready to proceed?
I am. Thank you.
Okay, great. Then, Mr. Masterman, you can ask your next question on cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. And can you hear me okay now too?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Great, and I apologize for my own audio issues earlier. Well, good afternoon now, Representative Harrison, and you can hear me as well?
I can. Thank you.
Okay. And as I mentioned just before we broke, I just have a few more questions for you, and they relate to the demonstrative that plaintiff's counsel showed you, PDX 1-14, and that should be coming up on your screen now. And can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. The top right-hand side of this chart records the votes in the Senate to override the governor's veto of Senate Bill 824. Is that right?
Yes.
The one Democratic aye vote listed here, do you understand that to be from Senator Joel Ford?
Yes, that's my understanding.
He's not listed in the box of overlapping senators, is he?
He is not. I cannot recall when he was elected.
And we were discussing earlier a Democratic primary sponsor of Senate Bill 824. That was Senator Ford, correct?
Yes.
And Senator Ford is African American, correct?
Yes.
This chart does not show all of the Democratic senators who voted for Senate Bill 824. Is that correct?
That's right, because it's just overlapping between 589 and 824.
So Senator Don Davis, for example, he voted for the final version of Senate Bill 824 that went to the governor. Is that right?
That's my recollection. Yes.
And Senator Davis is also not listed among the overlapping legislators on this table, is he?
Right. This is a veto override vote specifically.
And is Senator Davis African American?
He is.
Senator Ben Clark voted for Senate Bill 824 on its second reading in the Senate. Is that right?
Yes, and that's my recollection.
Do you recall whether he was absent for the third reading and for the Senate vote to override the governor's veto? Or I'm sorry, and for the Senate vote on the version of the bill that went to the governor?
Your Honor, objection. Representative Harrison's not in the Senate.
Give me just 1 second. The objection's overruled. You may answer the question.
I do not remember with respect to Senator Clark. I wasn't in the chamber. These are what I've read in the news accounts of the vote.
Senator Clark, though, is also not listed in the overlapping senators on this table, is he?
No, he's not, and I cannot recall when he was elected.
Okay. He's African American as well, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. The bottom right-hand side of this chart records the votes in the House to override the governor's veto of Senate Bill 824. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And the one Democratic aye vote listed here, do you understand that to be from Representative Dwayne Hall?
Yes, that's my recollection. Yes.
Representative Hall is not listed among the overlapping representatives on this table, is he?
He is not. I don't remember if he was there for the House Bill 589 concurrence vote. If he did, I'm pretty sure he was not a yes.
Based on your experience serving with Representative Hall, would he ever vote for a bill if racial discrimination were a motivating factor for the bill?
I can't speak for him, honestly. I can't speak for him.
Based on your experience serving with him, can you say whether he would ever vote for a bill that targeted African Americans' access to the franchise because African Americans vote for Democrats in a predictable manner?
I can't, honestly, I can't, I cannot say that. I cannot say that.
This chart also does not show all the Democratic representatives who voted for Senate Bill 824, correct?
That's accurate because this is just overlapping. I believe Representative Goodman voted for Senate Bill 824 on second and third readings. But I don't remember.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just don't remember if there were others. I think it was just Representative Goodman and Hall in the House.
So Representative Goodman, if he voted on third reading, that means he voted to pass Senate Bill 824 out of the House, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Excuse me.
And Representative Goodman is also not listed among the overlapping representatives on this chart. Is that correct?
That is accurate. He did not vote to override, and I'm fairly certain he would not have voted for the House Bill 589. I don't believe there was a Democrat who voted for Senate Bill, House Bill 589.
Okay. And Is it fair to say that based on your experience serving with Representative Goodman, you are not able to say whether he would ever vote for a bill if racial discrimination were a motivating factor for the bill?
Right, and that's so I'm not super comfortable saying that, but I know what he said on the floor, and that was that if I recall correctly, that he was voting for that bill because his constituents pressured him to.
Did he say that he was voting for the bill because it targeted African Americans, because African Americans vote Democrat in a predictable way?
No, he did not.
And just so I'm clear on your testimony, you're not comfortable saying what his or any other representative's intent might have been, is that right?
Well, I would say that's right, except that, yeah, I would say that's somewhat accurate. I think there's an obvious impact of the legislation, and so there was an intent behind the legislation. So I guess you could draw conclusions from that.
Right, and just to be a little clearer with my question, you can't say that you know that a majority of the General Assembly voted in favor of Senate Bill 824 for a racially discriminatory reason, correct?
I cannot say that racial bias entered into it, and I would not say that racial bias entered into it. I would say that based on our experience with House Bill 589, that target African American voters, that they're because they often vote Democratic, that might have been the reason for the kinds of IDs that were allowed under Senate Bill 824. So I'm not sure how to articulate that in response to your question, but I don't want to accuse anyone of racial bias or racial animus.
Thank you, Representative. If I may just check my notes for one moment, Your Honor. I have Representative Harrison. I thank you very much for answering my questions. I have nothing further for you at this time.
Thank you.
Mr. Cox, you may cross-examine the witness.
Hello, Representative Harrison. This is Paul Cox from the Attorney General's office. I just want to say hello. I don't have any questions for you. Thank you.
Redirect examination, Ms. Klein.
Yes, Your Honor, I'll be very brief. Thank you. Representative Harrison, when the House was considering House Bill 824, did you have any updated data on ID possession rates broken down by the type of ID?
We did not have any updated data.
Would that have been helpful in your mind?
Well, I believe it would, but we would know who lacked the kind of ID that was being proposed, and it would have been helpful to know who was being disenfranchised by the bill.
So with reference, you were asked about the amendment, the proposed amendment to add state and federal public assistant IDs. What do you recall the purpose of this and other similar amendments to add forms of ID, even without having updated data on possession rates by type of ID?
Well, my recollection was the point was made that these were disproportionately held by African American voters. The student IDs are obviously held by students, and that answers the question.
And what was the purpose for bringing amendments to Senate Bill 824 generally for your caucus?
Our hope and goal was to enact an ID requirement that was as broad as possible, and that did not limit eligible voters from the right to vote.
You were asked whether you had personally sought any data from the state board. And I want to ask in general, for a given bill, who is responsible for presenting information relevant to that specific bill in committees or on the chamber floor?
Well, generally it's the bill sponsor or the bill manager, and that's generally how it works. I was thinking about that question earlier, and then wasn't if there was a lot of time to kind of gather that information too, but generally it's the bill manager, bill sponsor.
And in general, is it fair to say the bill sponsors have more earlier indication than non-bill sponsors about what kind of information might be helpful to the chamber?
That would be accurate.
You were asked whether your concern with Senate Bill 824 was how it would be, quote, implemented. Can you explain what you understand implemented to mean in that context?
Well, it was a couple of things. Both in terms of the kinds of IDs that would be delineated in the proposed legislation, but also how it would be how the poll workers and judges, election judges at the various precincts would receive this and react. And I while it was anecdotal, there was evidence of the wide disparity in terms of how poll workers and poll judges treated the reasonable impediments, the kinds of IDs that were available. And I was worried about the lack of uniformity and in terms of how these requirements were interpreted. And I mean, this doesn't just happen with regard to voter ID. It happens with other elections related issues. And I've sat in on provisional ballot counting and seen how those are treated differently. So I think I was sort of acutely aware after having sat through the recount in 2016 about how this and watching the experience with the March primary about what this might mean for voters.
You were also asked about Guilford County early voting sites increasing in 2020. Do you have an understanding of why in 2020 specifically there may have been more early voting sites than previous years?
Wow, I cannot recall. I mean, there were. I know there was legislation that limited flexibility on early voting, but I can't recall if it was related to that or something else. I'm drawing a blank. I'm sorry.
Representative Harrison, sitting here today, do you know for certainty whether the Guilford County Board of Elections has the resources, if it even were allowed, to have staffing and photography equipment at every one of its early voting sites in order to offer IDs to voters?
I cannot say that, and I know from my conversations with our elections director that this was going to be a real problem for him in terms of implementing the requirement. They did not have the resources or the equipment. That's what he indicated to me during the Senate Bill 824 debate.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Your Honor, if I may, that last, if I may move to strike that last response as hearsay.
Hold on just 1 second. Yeah, the motion to strike is denied. You have any recross?
One moment, Your Honor, if I may check my notes. I have no further questions for Representative Harrison. I just thank you again for answering mine.
Mr. Cox, do you have any other questions?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
Representative Harrison, thank you for being here. Your testimony now being concluded, you are free to leave the courtroom. Ms. Riggs, who will be the next witness for the plaintiff?
Thank you, Your Honor. My colleague, Paul Brockman, will be calling Mr. Joel Ford.
And good afternoon, Your Honors. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can. Can you
Okay,
give me just 1 second?
of course.
Who will be cross-examining this witness on behalf of the legislative defendant?
Your Honor, Mr. P. Patterson will be doing so.
All right, and for the state defendant?
Paul Cox, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Brockman, you may call the plaintiff's next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Plaintiff's called Joel Ford.
Mr. Ford, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We've got you loud and clear. Thank you. Mr. Brockman, you may, well, I'll tell you what, Mr. Ford, can you please raise your right hand? Madam Clerk, if you would please swear in the witness.
Do you solemnly affirm that your testimony to the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and this is your solemn affirmation?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. You can lower your hand.
All right, Mr. Brockman, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Paul Brockman. I'm one of the lawyers for the plaintiffs in this case. I'm going to ask you some questions, but first, could you please state your full name for the record?
It is Joel Ford.
Thank you. And thank you for taking the time to be here today, Mr. Ford. I have just a few basic background questions for you to get started. You were previously a member of the North Carolina Senate representing the 38th District. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were elected as a Democrat?
That is correct.
And you were one of the primary sponsors of SB 824, the voter ID law that is at issue in this case. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you submitted an affidavit on behalf of the defendants in support of SB 824 on June 17th, 2019. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you
That's
did that
correct.
because you hoped your affidavit would be helpful to defending the law. Is that right?
That is correct.
Your Honors, pursuant to North Carolina Rule 611C, the plaintiffs would ask that the court find that Mr. Ford is a witness identified with an adverse party and permit the use of leading questions during his examination.
Are there any objections to that for the legislative or state defendants?
No, Your Honor.
Your
I
Honor.
think that was that Mr. Cox?
Yes, Your Honor. Sorry, Mr. Cox. On behalf of the state defendants, no objection.
All right. And for the legislative defendants, Mr. Patterson, do you have any objection to that?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Then you may examine the witness as an adverse witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Ford, you were approached by Senator Berger's staff about submitting your affidavit in this case. Isn't that right?
I'm not sure, but I was approached by whom. I'm not sure, but I was approached.
Do you recall that you gave a deposition in this case in June of, I believe, 2019?
Yes, I do.
And do you recall being asked about the steps that led to you submitting an affidavit in this case?
I do not recall those steps.
Ashley, if we could please bring up page 15 and 16 of Mr. Ford's deposition. And for the record, I'm going to be bringing up page 15, line 12 through page 16, line 8. Mr. Ford, are you able to see this on your screen?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And do you see you were asked, turning your attention to the affidavit that you prepared in this case, and I will get it in front of you shortly, how did you come to be submitting an affidavit for this case? You answered, I was approached.
Okay, yes. Those are my words, and yes, I was approached.
Okay, and then skipping down a little bit to line 23, do you see you were asked, so the law firm of your counsel sitting beside you today, Cooper and Kirk, and you answered, yes, I was approached first by the leadership in the North Carolina Senate. Would I listen to a conversation? And I listened to the conversation by counsel representing the leadership of the North Carolina Senate. Question, what is his or her name? Answer, Andrew. He's the chief of staff for Senator Berger. Do you see that?
Yes, I do recall that.
Okay, and that was truthful and honest testimony when you gave it during your deposition, correct?
That is correct.
And does that refresh your recollection that you were approached by Senator Berger's staff about submitting your affidavit in this case?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, at the time, you were not eager about submitting an affidavit. Isn't that true?
I don't recall about an eagerness at that particular time.
Okay. Let's look at your deposition at page 16, lines 22 to 23. And actually, Ashley, if we could scroll up just a couple of lines for the full context. And so you were asked, did you hesitate at all to participate? Answer, I thought about it. Question, were you eager to do so? Answer, I wouldn't use the term eager. Do you see all that?
I do.
And that was also truthful and honest testimony when you gave it?
That was also truthful and honest testimony.
Okay, and does that refresh your recollection that you were not eager about submitting your affidavit at the time you were
That's
first
correct.
approached? Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you. And now, before you ultimately signed and submitted your affidavit, you had a conversation with Senator Berger, is that right?
I'm not sure when I had a conversation with Senator Berger, but if I previously stated that I did, then I did, but I do not recall exactly when.
Okay, well, let's see if we can clarify that. If we can go to page 21, Ashley, of the deposition, please. And you see here at line 6, you were asked, when was the conversation with Philip Berger? And you answered, oh gosh, a week ago.
That is correct.
Okay, and Ashley, if we could just go to the cover page of the deposition. Mr. Ford, do you recall that your deposition took place on June 20th of 2019?
I will have to rely on the court records for that. And so that would be correct.
Okay, and you signed and submitted your affidavit on June 17th, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so if you had a conversation with Senator Berger about a week before June 20th, does that refresh your recollection that you had that conversation before you signed and submitted your affidavit?
That's correct.
And at that time, Senator Berger was a leader of the Republican Party in the North Carolina Senate, correct?
That's correct.
And you're aware he's also one of the defendants in this case?
I am aware.
Okay. And during that conversation with Senator Berger, where you talked about your participation, you told him you were interested in serving on the Board of Governors of the University of North Carolina, correct?
That is correct.
Seats on the Board of Governors are highly sought after, are they not?
I'm just now being made aware of that. Yes.
Okay, they're hard to get.
That's my understanding.
Okay, and people are nominated and appointed to the Board of Governors by the legislature, right?
That is correct.
And up to that point, when you spoke to Senator Berger, you had not been nominated to the board. Isn't that true?
That is true.
Okay, and just recently, last month, you were in fact nominated and appointed to the Board of Governors by the North Carolina Senate. Isn't that correct?
That is true.
And the Republican Party still controls a majority of seats in the North Carolina legislature?
While they control a simple majority, that is correct.
And Senator Berger is still a Republican leader in the Senate, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And you're aware that of the recent appointees to the Board of Governors, you were the only Democrat appointed, is that right?
I was made aware of that by a reporter prior when my name was submitted for nominations. Prior to that, sir, I did not know that.
Okay, but you don't dispute that that's true, do you?
Based upon public record, I have not looked at each individual member's political affiliation.
Okay. Ashley, let's bring up what's been pre-marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 88. And just for the record, this is a web article from the Daily Tar Heel titled, "Who are the voting members of the UNC Board of Governors?" And if we could please scroll to PDF page 4. And if we could scroll down to Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford, are you able to see this clearly on your screen?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and so you're identified here as a newly appointed member. You see that?
I do.
And your party affiliation is identified as Democrat. Do you see that?
Correct.
Okay, and now directly underneath Mr. Ford, do you see that Mr. John A. Fraley is identified? We'll blow it up for you.
Yes, I do.
And he's also identified as a newly appointed member?
That is correct.
And his political affiliation is Republican?
That's correct.
Okay, and scrolling down to the next newly appointed member, do you see Sonia Nichols identified there?
I do.
Okay, and her political affiliation is also identified as Republican, right?
Yes.
And below Ms. Nichols is Kirk Bradley. Do you see that?
Yes.
He's also a newly appointed member.
Yes.
His political affiliation is classified as unknown.
Yes.
Okay, and then finally, under Mr. Bradley, we see Lee Roberts. Do you see that?
Yes.
And he's also identified as a newly appointed member.
Yes.
And his political affiliation is identified as Republican. Is that right?
That's correct.
So, Mr. Ford, based on this, and I understand you haven't personally verified this, but assuming this is correct, would you agree with me that of the recent newly appointed members, you were the only identified Democrat?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Ashley, we can take that down. Mr. Ford, I want to talk about the series of events that led you to becoming a primary sponsor of SB 824. You were elected to the Senate as a member of the Democratic Party. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you first assumed office in 2013. Is that right?
That's correct.
You were reelected in 2014. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were also reelected in 2016. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. In 2018, you ran for reelection, but you lost in the primary to a Democratic challenger. Is that right?
That is correct.
And that was in May of 2018?
That is correct.
Your Democratic opponent in the primary was politically to the left of you. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you believe that you lost your primary in part because you voted for certain Republican initiatives during your time in the Senate, correct?
Yes, that's partially correct. But ultimately, I want to state for the record, I take responsibility for my loss.
Okay, understood. But you don't disagree that voting for Republican initiatives during your tenure was a reason that you lost your primary, do you?
I voted for, and I want to be clear, and I want to state this for the record, I voted for good public policy. And that may have been sponsored by Republicans, but I viewed it as good public policy.
Understood. And my question is only whether you believe that the fact that you voted for certain initiatives that were sponsored by Republicans led to you losing your primary to a challenger who was politically to your left.
That's a fair statement.
And after you lost that primary election, you understood that you were not going to be reelected to the Senate for the term beginning in 2019, correct?
That's correct.
And after you lost that primary, you also thought about switching political parties. Isn't that true?
That's correct. But I also thought about being an unaffiliated voter, registered voter as well.
Okay, but you don't deny that you thought about switching parties to the Republican Party, do you?
I don't deny thinking about becoming an unaffiliated voter or a Republican registered voter at that time. That is my true statement.
Okay. And after you lost your primary in May 2018, a couple of months after that, in July, you were publicly suggesting that you were thinking about voting with the Republican Party. Isn't that right?
I don't recall that. Again, if in context, I am a public policy initiative first, and political affiliation is not the primary goal here. That's just not who I am.
Mr. Ford, do you use Twitter?
Yes, I do.
Okay, Ashley, let's put up what we've marked as PX73. This is a tweet from Senator Ford, was sent on July 18th, 2018. Mr. Ford, do you recognize this as a tweet that was sent from your official account?
I do recognize that tweet.
Okay, and you were responding here to an announcement that Charlotte had been selected as a site for the 2020 Republican National Convention. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And in substance, you asked in your tweet, is it okay to vote with the Republicans? Do you see that?
I do see that.
Okay. And you said asking for a friend. That's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way that people ask for information for themselves when they're a little embarrassed about the question, right?
I don't know about being embarrassed, but the intent behind the tweet is that you have a supermajority of Democrats for the city of Charlotte City Council who approved the Republican convention. That's what that tweet was about.
Okay. But you were asking in light of that if it was okay to vote with the Republicans, right?
That's correct.
And a couple of months after this, in September of 2018, you publicly endorsed a Republican candidate for Senate, right?
In Jeff Tart, Senator Jeff Tart. That is correct.
Okay, right. So let's, if we can, I'd like to publish to the court what we've pre-marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 81. This is an article from the Charlotte Observer dated September 10th, 2018, titled, "This Republican State Senator from Mecklenburg Just Picked Up an Unusual Endorsement." And Mr. Ford, do you recognize this as an article about your endorsement of Senator Tart?
I do.
And you recall that Republicans at this time held a supermajority in the General Assembly?
I'm not sure, but if they did, according to the record or the facts, then that would be correct.
In 2018, when SB 824, the bill that is at issue in this case, was being considered, the Republicans had a supermajority. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And this article and your endorsement of Senator Tart was from September 2018, right?
That is correct.
Okay. So does that help you remember that the Republicans had a supermajority at the time you made this endorsement?
That is correct.
Okay. And looking at PDF page 2, do you see where the article says that Ford's endorsement comes as North Carolina Democrats have been working hard to flip seats in the state legislature come November in order to break that supermajority? Do you see that?
I do.
Break the supermajority was a rallying cry.
I
Do
see
you see
that.
that?
Mhm.
And do you recall that from your time in the Senate that the Democrats were actively working on breaking the supermajority?
That is correct.
Okay. So now if we can go to PDF page 3. And Mr. Ford, do you see here that the article reports that Senator Tart's seat was seen by Democrats as one of the most flippable, in large part because he was running in a redrawn district that went for Hillary Clinton in 2016? Do you see that?
I see that.
Do you have any reason to disagree with that assessment?
No, I do not.
Do you recall having any discussions with Senator Tart about any concerns he had about his seat being flippable?
No, other than the conversation was that it was highly competitive and that he would like to have my endorsement.
Okay. And despite the fact that the Democrats were working on breaking the supermajority and flipping seats, and despite the fact that Senator Tart's race was very competitive, you chose to support him anyway. Is that right?
I chose to support a friend. Yes.
Okay. And a little bit further down on this page, do you see that this article reports Senator Tart's opponent as saying that although Mr. Ford, although he claims to be a Democrat, voted overwhelmingly with my opponent and the GOP? Do you see that?
I do, which is not a correct statement.
Okay, and so you would disagree that you voted overwhelmingly with the GOP, is that right?
That is correct. That is a falsehood, and it was reported by the same newspaper, the Charlotte Observer, that stated, based upon my overall voting record, that I did not vote overwhelmingly with the GOP.
Okay, fair enough, and I appreciate that. But you don't deny that you did, in fact, vote for Republican initiatives during your time in the Senate, do you?
I do not.
Okay. And a little bit further down on PDF page 3, do you see that Mr. Tartt's, Senator Tartt's opponent is further quoted as saying, "This endorsement comes as no surprise and it will be meaningless." Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And do you recall reading these statements or hearing these statements from Senator Tartt's opponent at the time?
I do not.
Okay. Sitting here today and reading them, do you understand that Senator Tartt's opponent was questioning whether your endorsement would carry any weight with Democrats?
I'm not
Question, Your Honor. He
surprised.
just said he had not read it.
Second. The objection is sustained. Ask your
Mr.
next question.
Mr. Ford, you have stated publicly that because you didn't always agree with Democrats, you were called a sellout. Isn't that true?
I don't know if I've ever used the term sellout, but it was not favorably looked upon.
Okay. You've also stated publicly that after everything you'd done for the Democratic Party, you were hurt by the way people treated you and you felt like you were a man without a party. Isn't that true?
Now, that is true.
Okay. And you just don't recall one way or the other whether you have said publicly that you've been characterized as a sellout by your colleagues?
I don't recall that, but
You
I
don't
do
deny it?
recall being. No, I'm not going to admit something that I don't remember saying or believe that to be true, but I do agree with the fact that I was hurt and disappointed in the way that some Democrats had treated me. Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Ford, do you recall appearing as a guest on a podcast called The Urban Conservative last year in May 2020?
I do.
Okay. Do you remember during that podcast you were asked what it's like being part of a party and having issues with that party and about how you were treated?
Vaguely remember.
Okay. Ashley, if we could play PX 85, please. And for the record, this is a clip of a portion of the Urban Conservative from May 2020.
The question where we were going was, I appreciate and respect that you acknowledge that there's some things within the Democratic Party that you're not happy with, like that things you're not comfortable with. And how has that been being a part of a party and having issues? You know, how have you been treated in that regard? I'm just curious about that.
I have, I've been name called, sellout.
Mr. Ford, does that refresh your recollection on this question?
Absolutely.
Okay. And again, you don't deny that you were called a sellout, do you?
Among other things, that's correct.
Okay. And as I think you testified earlier, you don't deny that you were upset and disappointed with the way you were treated by members of the party?
Upset, disappointment, yes.
Okay. So now, because you lost your primary, you were not on the ballot as a Democrat in November 2018. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. But one of the issues that was on the ballot was a proposal to amend the North Carolina Constitution to require photo ID for voting. Is that right?
That is correct.
The text of that ballot initiative did not tell voters what forms of ID would be acceptable if the amendment passed, correct?
That is correct.
And it did not include proposed implementing legislation either. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. A majority of North Carolina voters voted in favor of the ID amendment in November 2018, right?
That is correct.
Okay. Do you know if your voters from District 38 voted in favor of it?
I would say that I voted with my voters at the time. I did not support the initiative to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot, and neither did the majority of the citizens of District 38 at that time.
Okay. And in the November 2018 election, the voters also voted out enough incumbent Republicans such that the Republicans lost their supermajority. Do you recall that?
That's correct.
Okay. And at this time in November of 2018, Roy Cooper, a Democrat, was the governor. Is that right?
That's correct.
And he had the power to veto legislation. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So would you agree with me, Mr. Ford, that the voters in 2018 expressed that they wanted some form of voter ID and that they did not want the incoming legislature to be able to override a gubernatorial veto without a bipartisan vote?
I didn't draw that conclusion.
Okay. Why not? What part of my question do you disagree with?
Well, I don't know what the mind and the will of over 2 million voters who supported photo ID would think about the current sitting legislature implementing the legislation that they had voted for.
Okay. Would you agree with me that the outcome of the November 2018 election shows that the voters wanted the legislature to become more bipartisan?
That's a conclusion that if you want to draw that conclusion, here's my conclusion. So the voters of this state decided that the Council of State would remain in the hands of the majority of Republicans, but voted in a Democratic governor. So I don't know how you can draw any other conclusion that the voters of this state have a mind of their own.
Okay. And so is it your testimony that based on vote records, you simply can't discern the will of the people?
I was a member I represented Senate District 38. I voted the will of my district at the time by not supporting the constitutional amendment. And I was a legislator at the time. And so what I was doing was my job, which was legislating.
Sure. And my question, just referencing your prior testimony about voters having a mind of their own, is it your testimony that based on election results alone, you cannot discern the will of the people?
Yes, because the voters of this state decided that they wanted to make voter photo ID a part of our Constitution. That is a clear signal that that's what the voters wanted.
Okay, so you think you can discern the will of the people that they wanted photo ID, is that correct?
Based upon their vote, the state's vote of over 2 million people wanting to see that as a part of our state's Constitution. That to me is an affirmative that they wanted photo ID.
Okay. And you agreed with me that what they voted for did not include the list of photo IDs that would be accepted, correct?
That language was not available at the time.
Right. And the voters who sent the signal that they wanted photo ID also did not have in front of them the implementing legislation, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Do you recall that in the same election, the voters also voted in favor of a victims' rights constitutional amendment called Marsy's Law?
I do recall that the voters voted for that initiative, and I also recall the tremendous campaign among my Democratic colleagues wanting to oppose that.
Okay. Do you recall that Marsy's Law also required implementing legislation?
I do.
Okay. And do you recall that that implementing legislation was not passed until 2019?
I'm not aware of that. I wasn't active in the legislature at that time.
Okay. You don't remember voting in favor or against implementing legislation for Marsy's Law while you were still in the Senate in 2018, do you?
I do not. No, I don't believe that it came up.
Okay, right. So the voters voted in favor of the constitutional amendment, but the legislation, the implementing legislation, did not come up in the 2018 session, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. But when it came to voter ID, you believed there was a need to pass the voter ID legislation while the Republican majority had enough votes to override Governor Cooper's veto, rather than waiting for the new General Assembly to be constituted in January of 2019. Is that correct?
That was not a part of my thought process at all. As a current member of the legislature then, the opportunity came before me to support and work on legislation for voter photo ID, and I did my job.
Okay, Ashley, if we could bring up PX5, Mr. Ford, this is your affidavit that you submitted in this case on June 17th, 2019. Do you recognize that?
What am I looking at here?
Maybe we can blow it up a little bit for you. I think it should say affidavit of Joel Ford. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and you see there, you said under penalty of perjury, the following information is true to the best of my knowledge. You see that?
That's correct.
Okay, and if we could just scroll down to paragraph 9. And Mr. Ford, do you see here that you said in your affidavit that you submitted under oath, certainly there was a perceived need to pass the voter ID legislation while the Republican majority had enough votes to override Governor Cooper's veto, rather than waiting for the new General Assembly to be constituted in January of 2019? Do you see that?
I do see it.
Okay, and does that refresh your recollection that you believed or certainly perceived at the time that there was a need to pass the voter ID legislation while the Republican majority could still override Governor Cooper's veto?
I do believe that that was a reason that the leadership would want to bring forward the photo ID legislation, but it wasn't a factor in my participation. It wasn't a factor in my decision to work on voter photo ID.
So is it your testimony here today that when you referred to this perceived need in your affidavit, you were referring to the thought processes of the Republican leadership of the General Assembly?
That is purely speculation. I'm not a member, I was never a member of the Republican caucus and did not have those kinds of discussions. And when I made that statement, that was based upon pure speculation.
When you made the statement in your affidavit under oath, you were speculating?
I have no reason to believe anything other than it was just that. I mean, the numbers, the Republicans had a supermajority, yes, and that was the reality at the time. So yes.
So yes, what? You were speculating when you submitted your affidavit under oath?
There was certainly a perceived need to pass voter ID legislation while the Republicans had a supermajority. I stand by that statement.
Okay. And you felt that doing that, passing voter ID while the Republicans had a supermajority, was the only way to pass meaningful voter ID legislation reflecting the will of the electorate. Isn't that correct?
That's not the only way to pass meaningful legislation at any time. It is not, but it was an opportunity that I was presented with, and I took the opportunity.
Okay, if we can go down just a couple of sentences in the same paragraph, do you see in your affidavit where you said, for those legislators like myself who wanted to be sure that meaningful voter ID legislation was enacted, reflecting the will of the electorate that had just approved a voter ID amendment, we knew that such legislation had to be passed when there were enough votes to override the governor's veto? Do you see that?
I do see that.
Okay, and you were telling the truth when you put that in your affidavit, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so does that remind you that, in fact, you did believe that it was necessary to pass voter ID while Republicans still had a supermajority?
That is correct. And in the same context, making sure that we had bipartisan support for that, and we did.
Okay, well, we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But first, I want to ask you, when you said in your affidavit meaningful, you thought that meant, you equate the word meaningful with bipartisan, do you not?
I do, absolutely.
Okay, and you understand that during the lame duck session, Republicans could have passed SB 824 over Governor Cooper's veto without any votes from the Democrats, right?
That is correct.
And in the 2019 legislature, the only way to pass a voter ID bill over the governor's veto would have been if the bill attracted multiple votes from Democrats. Isn't that true?
I don't know about multiple, perhaps maybe one, maybe two, but yes, it would have required bipartisan support then, just like it did when it passed in 2018.
What would have required bipartisan support in 2019, correct?
That's correct.
It didn't require bipartisan support in 2018, correct?
Well, let's back up and bring a little clarity to that. It would not have required bipartisan support. It would have required bipartisan support if it had been vetoed. I still believe, if my math and memory serves me correctly, that the Republicans still had a majority of votes in the state Senate.
Right, and I appreciate that clarification. Just talking about if the law were vetoed because you believe there was a need to pass legislation over the governor's veto, it would have required bipartisan support in 2019, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, and that's because the voters in the 2018 election voted out enough Republicans to break the supermajority, correct?
That's correct.
So the will of the voters would have required Democratic support to override the veto if voter ID had been passed in 2019, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. But you believe that it was more bipartisan to override the governor's veto in 2018 when no Democratic votes would have been required. Is that right?
Restate the question again.
Sure. Did you believe it was more bipartisan to override the governor's veto in 2018 when no Democratic votes were required than it would have been in 2019 when Republicans and Democrats would have had to work together to override a veto?
That's not the way that I viewed my job. And so as a legislator, I believe that my duty was first to legislate. And for me, and call me politically naive, I'm not looking at what the numbers of Democrats and Republicans are. Is this something that I could support, I could believe in, and could I improve it? And so that was my motivation. So hopefully that I answered your question.
I'm not sure that you did, unfortunately, so I'll try to ask it one more time. You thought it was more bipartisan to override the governor's veto in 2018 when no Democratic votes were necessary to do that than it would have been to allow voter ID to be passed in 2019 when Republicans and Democrats would have to work together to override a veto?
So yeah, okay. So here's a little bit of insight into what I was thinking. You're absolutely correct. The Republicans did not need any Democratic support to pass photo ID legislation because you're right, they did have a supermajority. But this is the thing that I think that it's really important to try to understand. When I was in the North Carolina Senate representing District 38, my district has the most crime, the highest unemployment, underemployment, the most failing, underperforming public schools, and a community that needs access to high quality, affordable health care. I just did not want to pass up an opportunity like I did in previous pieces of legislation to work to improve the legislation to make sure that my constituents, which were majority Democrats and a large number of Black North Carolinians, interest was represented. I feel that way now, and I felt that way then.
Does SB 824, the voter ID law, have anything to do with crime, Mr. Ford?
It is a perspective that I wanted to bring to the table as it relates to what my mindset was in participating in this particular piece of legislation that did not need my nor any other Democrat's help.
Okay, is that a no?
No.
And does SB 824, the voter ID bill, have anything to do with education outcomes in your District 38?
No.
Okay. And when you say your mindset of wanting to work with the other side, was that to try to improve your chances of working collaboratively in the future?
No.
Okay, because
In
you weren't
working
going to
with
be
the,
in the Senate in 2019,
in working collaboratively on this particular piece of legislation, a piece of legislation that I had previously, along with Republicans and Democrats, had submitted before.
Okay, we'll talk about the voter ID bill that you previously submitted a little bit later, but I'd just like to stick for now on this question of bipartisanship. So just to be clear that, for the record, did you think it would be more bipartisan if voter ID was enacted over the governor's veto in 2019 or in 2018?
Objection. This has been asked and answered several times.
Just 1 second. The objection's overruled.
Mr. Ford, would you like me to re-ask the question just so that it's fresh?
Please do.
Would it have been more bipartisan for the General Assembly to enact voter ID over the governor's veto in 2019 or in 2018?
I believe that they're the same.
Even though there were no Democratic votes required to override the governor's veto in 2018?
I think all meaningful legislation that is sustainable should have bipartisan support, no matter what the vote count is.
So in your mind, one vote from somebody across the aisle equates to bipartisanship?
That is correct.
And it doesn't matter if you get multiple votes from the other side of the aisle, that doesn't make it more bipartisan?
That would be helpful, but bipartisan support is bipartisan support.
Okay. Now, with respect to the governor's veto, you're not aware of any effort to actually discuss with Governor Cooper whether there was a voter ID law that he would have been willing to sign. Is that correct?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. So you thought it was important for the law to be bipartisan, but you're not aware of any effort to try to see if you could get agreement from the governor who was from the other party about the voter ID law that was being considered?
Well, I'm trying to think back. During my time in the legislature, I'm not aware of any voter ID that would have been supported by the governor.
But you didn't ask him, right?
I personally did not ask, and I'm trying to recall if he had sent over a representative to the Democratic caucus to represent his interests, but I personally did not ask. But again, it is my understanding and belief that the then current sitting governor would not have supported any voter photo ID.
Okay, so it's your understanding and belief that despite the constitutional amendment, Governor Cooper would have vetoed any and all voter ID legislation that passed his desk?
I cannot say that. I do not know what was in the governor's thoughts, mind, or process as it relates to that. I'm just not aware of any photo ID legislation that the governor would have supported.
Okay. And just to be clear, do you think that it would have been bipartisan if the General Assembly had been able to enact a voter ID law with the consent of the governor rather than over his veto?
I'm sure that the support of the governor would have helped some, but I respect the divisions and boundaries of our state's constitution, where you have a legislative body and you have an executive branch and the judicial.
Understood. And I'm just asking whether, by your definition of bipartisanship, a bill that the governor from the party that was not in control of the assembly, whether a governor being willing to sign that would have been an indication of bipartisanship.
I, again, look at the legislative process separately, and legislators legislate, and the governor is the executor or the administrator of the legislation.
Governor Cooper was a Democrat, correct?
Yes, Governor Cooper is a Democrat.
And your definition of bipartisanship is that it attracts support from members of the opposite party, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So would it have been more bipartisan if the voter ID law had attracted the support of the governor, a Democrat?
I think I don't want to confuse the two. Legislators legislate. Legislators are the ones who enact laws. It is the governor's responsibility to administer those laws.
And so if you could try to please answer my question, would it have been more bipartisan under your definition of the word if the voter ID law had been signed by the governor from the opposite party of the party that controlled the legislature rather than vetoed?
That's not the way that I view it. I believe that had there been more Democrats who supported it, that would have been more bipartisan support. But that's not the way that I view it, respectfully speaking. We
Okay.
each have a role to play.
Understood. But you don't disagree that Governor Cooper would have been another Democrat supporting the bill if he signed it rather than vetoing it, do you?
That would have been another Democrat signing off on the bill.
Okay. And despite that, you are not aware of any effort to find out from the governor if there was a form of voter ID that he would have been willing to sign, correct?
I'm not aware of those conversations.
So just to take a couple of more steps back, about a week or so after the November 2018 election, do you recall that you sent an email to Senator Daniel on the subject of voter ID legislation?
I'm not sure, but I'm sure if you're able to produce it, it would refresh my memory.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. Ashley, if we could bring up what we've marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 79. This is a November 16 email from Senator Ford to Senator Daniel with the subject voter protection integrity / every vote counts. Can you see that, Mr. Ford?
Yes, I can.
Okay, and do you recognize this as an email that you sent to Senator Daniel?
That's correct.
And this attaches a copy of the 2013 voter ID bill that you co-sponsored and that you mentioned in your testimony a few minutes ago, right?
That is correct.
And you said in the body of your email to Senator Daniel, look at the co-sponsors, ! Correct?
That's correct.
And in addition to yourself, one of the co-sponsors was Senator Clark. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And also Senator Tart.
That is correct.
Okay. And so were you trying to convey
You're missing
to,
one, aren't you?
I may be. Why don't we scroll down and make sure we've got the record complete?
Yeah, I think that that's important. Yes.
There we go. You're right. Also Senator Kinnaird. Is that right?
Senator Kinnaird out of Chapel Hill. Yes. I remember her.
Okay, great. And so was this your way of signaling to Senator Daniel that, yes, there's hope. There are Democrats out there who are willing to sponsor voter ID legislation?
No, it wasn't a signal. It was an effort to inform Senator Daniels about the bipartisan support that was had at the time for voter photo ID.
Back in
I want to be
2013.
clear, it was not a signal. Say again?
I'm sorry, I spoke over you. I was asking, just clarifying for the record that that was with respect to your 2013 bill, correct?
Yes, and I said I wanted to be clear that it wasn't a signal, but it was a direct communication to look at, one, the bipartisan support, but two, secondly, the context of the bill.
Understood. And under this 2013 bill that you co-sponsored, a voter could vote either by having their photo taken by an election official and signing an affidavit, or by presenting a form of acceptable ID. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And the option to have your photo taken and sign an affidavit, that would have been available during early voting, correct?
That is correct.
And it also would have been an option that would be available to voters on election day too, correct?
That is correct.
And the forms of acceptable ID that you included in your draft bill included a voter registration card issued by the State Board of Elections or by a county board of elections, even if it does not contain a photograph of the voter, correct?
It's my understanding that a photo was taken at the time that the voter presented him or herself, which is the whole point of voter photo ID.
Okay. Let's scroll down a little bit. I believe it's on PDF page 5. And do you see there, and we can scroll up to make sure you have the full context, but under section 1, so Ashley, let's scroll up just a tiny bit there. As used in this section, photo identification means any of the following. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And then if we scroll back down to number 9, you see it says a voter registration card issued by the state or county, notwithstanding that it does not contain a photograph of the voter.
That's correct.
Okay, so under your proposed 2013 bill, people could show up at the polls and have their picture taken and sign an affidavit, right?
That's correct.
Or they could present a form of qualifying ID, including a voter registration card that didn't have a photo, right?
Yes, but they must have signed the affidavit. That is correct.
Okay. Ashley, we can take that down. And Mr. Ford, this 2013 bill we were just looking at, it never got a hearing back then in 2013, did it?
No, it did not.
Right. It died for lack of support.
That's correct.
Is that correct? Okay.
That's correct.
And instead of your 2013 bill that would have allowed voters to show up at the polls and get their photo taken and sign an affidavit, the General Assembly passed HB 589 instead, right?
The General Assembly passed HB 559.
Sure. Maybe my question was unclear. So your bill, the 2013 bill, didn't get a hearing, died for lack of support, right?
That's correct.
You recall that the General Assembly did pass a photo ID law back in 2013, right?
Yes, without my support.
Right. And that bill that you didn't support was HB 589, correct?
Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yes. I didn't support that bill. Okay.
Right. And that was the form of voter photo ID law that was passed instead of your bill, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And you know that a federal court found that that law, HB 589, targeted African American voters with almost surgical precision, right?
Yes. All I remember, sir, is that I did not support it.
Yeah. And do you recall why you didn't support it?
I want to say that there were photo ID would not have been provided at the Board of Elections. 2, it would not have been free. And 3, if I recall, there were restrictions on other forms of acceptable photo ID that I found too restrictive at the time to support.
Okay.
How did I do?
It's not a memory test. If that's what you remember, I'm happy to accept that testimony.
Okay.
And you're not denying that HB 589 was part of a court proceeding and that the Fourth Circuit found that the law was intentionally discriminatory, are you?
No, I'm not going to deny that.
Okay. Do you recall in the 2013 bill, HB 589, whether there was a form of free ID that was issued at the DMV, could be issued at the DMV?
I do believe that that was the case. Yes, I do believe that that was the case.
Okay. And so turning back now to 2018, your 2013 bill was not the model that was adopted in 2018 either. Is that correct?
Please provide clarity for, are you referring to my co-sponsored bill, the bipartisan photo ID bill that you're referring to?
Right. That's not the bill that the General Assembly decided to move forward with in 2018, is it?
It is not the exact bill, but a large part of the contents are a part of the photo ID bill that I did support and sponsor.
Okay. And now you're talking about SB 824 that you sponsored?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, SB 24. That bill, that content was a part of the 2018 bill that got passed.
Okay. That did not include a provision, SB 824 did not include a provision where voters could show up at an election site and sign an affidavit and have their picture taken and vote. Is that right?
Are you referring to the bill that I sponsored, or are you referring to the bill that I did not support nor sponsor?
I'm talking now about SB 824. Does SB 824 allow a voter to go have their picture taken, sign an affidavit, and cast a regular ballot?
Again, I'm asking for clarity because I'm trying to answer your question. Is this the bill that I sponsored, or is this the bill that I supported, or is this the one that I did not support?
So my question is about SB 824, which, as I understand it, is the bill that you were a primary sponsor of in 2018 that ultimately was enacted over the governor's veto.
Okay, yes. All right, yes. All right, now I'm clear.
Okay, great. And so my question was, could a voter under SB 824, consistent with your 2013 proposal, have their photo taken, sign an affidavit, and cast a regular ballot?
Yes.
That's your understanding of SB 824?
That's my understanding of SB 24, that a free photo ID would be provided for you on early vote and on election day. Sir, that is my understanding, and that is my recollection of SB 824.
Okay, and I'm not talking now about a free photo ID. I understand SB 824 provides for free photo ID, but could a voter just have their picture taken, sign an affidavit, and submit a regular ballot?
You have to be a registered voter first. Just like in the bill that I sponsored in 2013. This all has to do with registered voters being registered to vote in the state of North Carolina, and SB 24 provides you with a free photo ID if you do not have one.
Okay, so let's stick with SB 824. It's your understanding that it provides for voters to obtain a free photo ID during early voting. Is that right?
That is correct, and on election day.
Okay. We'll come back to that in just a second, but sticking for a moment to the early voting. Is it your understanding that the free IDs under SB 824 are to be provided at County Board of Elections?
That is correct, and at the early voting sites.
Okay. Is it your understanding that SB 824 requires that free photo ID printing equipment be provided at every early voting site?
That is correct.
That's your understanding of SB 824?
That is correct. That it is the county boards of elections' responsibility to provide free photo ID for every registered voter that does not have photo ID. That is my understanding.
Okay, and I think that may just be slightly different than the question that I asked, which is it your understanding that SB 824 mandates that a free photo ID printer be available at every early voting site?
I don't recall a mandate and a printer at every site. I just recall that the Board of Elections is responsible for providing free photo ID for every registered voter that does not have one.
Okay, and do you understand that those free photo IDs are, the way they're put together is somebody goes to get one and it's printed, there's a machine that prints the ID? Do you understand that?
I do understand that.
Okay, and all I'm trying to understand is whether it's your belief that SB 824 requires one of those printers to be available at every single early voting site.
I do not know that to be on the technical part of your question. I'm not sure, but I do know that if you don't have a photo ID and you're a registered voter, one will be provided for you for free, that the voter does not have to pay for that.
Okay, and so my question is just, I think you testified earlier that that free photo ID would be made available during early voting. Is that correct?
Early voting and election day.
Okay, and there are many early voting sites around the state, correct?
That is correct.
Sometimes it's at the county board office, correct?
That's correct.
Other times it's at a location other than the county board office, right?
That is correct.
Okay, and there are many election precincts on election day, right?
That is correct.
And lots of polling places other than the county board office?
That is correct.
Okay, but you don't know whether SB 824 requires equipment to provide free IDs to be available at all of those precincts or all of those early voting sites, right?
I don't recall that technical aspect of the bill. I do not. But I do know that the boards of elections are required to provide free photo ID.
Did you think that the law required those ID printers to be available at every precinct on election day and every early voting site?
In order for the Board of Elections to be able to produce photo ID, they would have to have some type of photographic equipment to provide free voter ID.
Right. And so what I'm asking is, did you think that that equipment would be available at every precinct on election day and at every early voting site?
Yes.
When you voted for SB 824, that was your belief, right?
It was my belief that the Board of Elections was responsible for producing free voter photo ID at early voting sites and on election day.
Okay, and when you agreed to sponsor the bill, you believed that that equipment would be available at every precinct on election day and at every early voting site, right?
I believe that the technology exists like it did in 2013, and I believe that the photos would be made available to the registered voters on early voting and on election day.
At all of the places where people could vote on election day and during early voting, right?
Yes, that is my understanding, and that is my interpretation of the legislation that was passed.
Okay. Now, when you were supporting this bill, SB 824, you did not think that in-person voter impersonation was a big problem, did you?
No, and I said so publicly.
Okay. Now, while SB 824 was being considered, you published an op-ed in support of the bill on December 5th, 2018. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Let's go ahead and bring that up. This is JX35. It should already be admitted into evidence. And Ashley, if you can just scroll through this slowly. Mr. Ford, I just want to ask you if you recognize this as the op-ed that you published in December of 2018.
Yes. That is my op-ed.
Okay. And the substance of the affidavit that you submitted in this case in defense of SB 824 is based on your op-ed. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And it's the case, is it not, that that this op-ed was actually drafted by a staffer for Senator Berger who didn't know you very well? Isn't that true?
I would beg to differ that the support staff that I received, which I would add for the record, is nonpartisan General Assembly support staff, and that I did receive some assistance in putting together this op-ed.
Okay. So I'd like to publish for the court what's marked as JX 746. And just before we do that, I'll just note this is a document was formerly designated as highly confidential. We've communicated with the legislative defendants. They've told us that they do not object to lifting that confidentiality designation for purposes of trial. I just want to take a beat and make sure that understanding is confirmed before we publish this to the court.
This is Pete Patterson for the legislative defendants, and we have agreed to lift the confidentiality on this document.
Mr. Cox, do you wish to be heard about that?
No, Your Honor, it's not our confidential designation.
Right, okay. Yes, then you may publish the exhibit. Sounds like the privilege has been waived.
Thank you. So just for the record, this is JX 746, and it is a November 2018 email chain discussing subject Joel Ford op-ed. Now, if we could scroll down to page 5 of the PDF. And a little bit further down. So there's an email here from Pat Ryan on November 30th, 2018 at 6:43 p.m. And you see there, Mr. Ford, that he's identified as being associated with Senator Berger.
That's correct.
Okay. And he says, I'd appreciate any feedback y'all have. I don't know Senator Ford at all. And this is, of course, a sensitive subject. Do you see that?
That's correct.
Okay. And then scrolling down there, do you see that this appears to be an early draft of the op-ed that we looked at just a minute or two ago?
That's correct.
Okay. And Mr. Ryan, to your knowledge, is a staffer for Senator Berger. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So he's a partisan staffer, correct?
I thought that all staff in the General Assembly was nonpartisan.
Okay. But you don't dispute that it appears that Mr. Ryan was drafting an early draft of your op-ed, right?
I do not dispute that. No.
Okay. It wasn't a staffer from your own staff.
No, we have very limited staff and very limited resources.
Okay. And you don't dispute Mr. Ryan's characterization that he didn't know you at all, right?
If that's his characterization, then absolutely.
Okay. Now, if we can scroll up just a little bit to page, just a little further up on page 5 of the PDF. You see here, there's an exchange with Brent Woodcox from Senator Tommy Tucker's office. Do you see that?
I do.
And this is reacting to the draft that Mr. Ryan had circulated. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And Mr. Woodcock says, so you would not be able to get a voter photo ID on election day in this bill. You would be able to get one throughout early voting, which is what the Ford Amendment allowed. Do you see that?
I do see it.
Okay. And that's different from your understanding of what SB 824 allowed, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You're right there. And I hate to interrupt Mr. Brockman. It's now 3:30, time for our afternoon break. We'll come right back to the same spot at 3:45. We'll be in recess until 3:45. Thank you.